Okay.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking some time to join us to celebrate the work of Batyr Berdyev, particularly with the launch of this poetry called Parting Song. We have a great panel assembled here today. We're looking forward to a conversation about the campaign that is really addressing some of the challenges in Turkmenistan in terms of enforced disappearances. That is the Prove They Are Alive campaign. My name is Alex Johnson. I lead Europe and Eurasia advocacy here at Open Society Foundations in Washington. And we're joined this morning by James Womack, an accomplished poet and one of the translators of this particular project, and Kate Waters, the executive director of Crude Accountability, which is a partner in the Prove They Are Alive campaign that has built some of the capacity and the movement around this particular project. So we're going to start with just some simple background and story about the development of this book and go through and talk about the process and some of the highlights of it and what you can do in terms of action in your community to try and draw attention to this particular case and the more than 100 others in Turkmenistan who are disappeared. So I think with that, how about we start with you, Kate, in terms of telling the Batyr story and a little bit about the campaign and how did this get started?
Great. First, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and thank you all for coming today. Turkmenistan is a country that not a lot of people know about, and really one of the goals of the campaign among other objectives has been to sort of put Turkmenistan on the map for some of the issues that are really critical for human rights and also for environmental rights, the other aspect that Crude Accountability works on. Crude Accountability is a nonprofit that's based here in the Washington, D.C. area, and we work in the Caspian Sea region and the Black Sea region on human rights and environmental rights, particularly in communities that are impacted by oil and gas development. And that might at first hearing sound like the issue of the disappeared and the issue of oil and gas are two things that are really very far removed from each other. But in fact, there are some very deep connections, particularly in Turkmenistan, but also throughout the Central Asian region, of sort of the money, the inflow of funding that comes into Turkmenistan, for example, and then where that money goes and what it's used to finance. And just one quick fact, 80% of the revenues that come into Turkmenistan from oil and gas are off budget. They do not go into the budget, 80%. Where that money goes, we have absolutely no idea, but when we start looking at the massive construction of this prison system into which people are disappeared, we maybe have some answers about the discretionary use of those funds by the leadership. So the Prove They Are Alive campaign, of which Crude Accountability is a member, along with a number of other international human rights organizations. We also have participation from Turkmen activists inside the country who do this at great risk to themselves, as you can imagine. The campaign was founded in 2014, and the objective of the campaign is very simple. It's to prove they are alive, to prove that those who have been disappeared into Turkmenistan's prison system are alive. For over 15 years, over 100, our current list is 113 individuals have been disappeared inside Turkmenistan's prison system. There have been several waves of disappearance. People who were, and the most famous group of them are people who were caught up in this alleged coup attempt, which took place in November of 2002 when then President Niyazov allegedly was sort of the victim or the target of an assassination attempt and also this effort to throw him out of office. And in conjunction with that incident, hundreds of people were arrested. On our list, I believe the number is 59 people who were disappeared who were Novemberists, as we call them, people who were connected somehow with this alleged coup attempt. And it was just a massive purge, really, a sweeping up of people who were maybe relatives of those who were sort of the leaders, including Batyr Berdyev, who was the former foreign minister and a very well-known, high-placed official and diplomat in the Turkmen government. And Batyr Berdyev was another of those who was implicated in this, although there's very little evidence to show that any of what they say transpired happened in the way that was described by the Turkmen government. But there were other waves of purges prior to the November 2002 incident. A number of highly placed bureaucrats were also swept up in a purge, some as early as the first part of 2002 and some even earlier. There are civil society activists who have been disappeared in prison, and there are a number of people, and these cases are increasing, sadly, under the new administration, of people who've been accused of religious extremism. So there are several groupings of people, and Batyr falls into this issue, or into this group of the Novembers, as they are called. I want to talk mostly about Batyr, but I think there are a couple of other things that I would like to raise, because we've been asked, and we are asked repeatedly, are things different now that Niyazov is not the president? Are things different under Batyr Berdyev? I was realizing, as I was sitting down to sort of gather my thoughts for this discussion, that Batyr Berdyev is no longer the new president of Turkmenistan. He's been in office for more than 10 years. And he has had numerous opportunities to disengage from the history of the past, to say, you know what, we want to have a different kind of Turkmenistan, we want to have a different country, we're going to let these people out of prison, we're going to prove they're alive. And he has not done that. And he has not done that for over 10 years. And not only that, but there continue to be people who disappear into the prison system. And as recently as a year ago, there's a large group of people who have disappeared. So this is an ongoing problem in Turkmenistan, and one that the Turkmen government really needs to address. Disappearance is a violation, as you all know, of numerous international covenants. Many of the people who are disappeared have been tortured. It's torture for them to be disappeared. It's torture for their families to not know where they are all of these years. None of them have been able to receive packages. None of them have been able to visit with relatives. None of them have been able to have access to legal representation or to medical care. So this is a gross human rights violation. And Batyr Berdyev is just one of these people who has been disappeared. The book of poetry is a collection of poems that Batyr Berdyev wrote in late 2002 and early 2003. He was arrested in November 2002. He went through a very quick trial. He was allegedly tortured. Even in pretrial detention, there are eyewitnesses who saw him after that. He said he was unrecognizably disfigured following his arrest and imprisonment. And so he immediately was sort of disappeared into the system. But the poems that are in this book were smuggled out, and the campaign obtained them through a circuitous route several years ago. And we knew immediately upon reading them that we wanted to publish these poems. They're extremely moving, and James, of course, will talk about that. They're beautifully written, and they were written to his son and to his wife. Some of them are hopeful, some of them are excruciatingly, painfully sad, but they bear witness to really a person who refused to stop, to give away his humanity. We did not want to publish the books without the permission of his family, obviously, and it was not an easy process for us to obtain those permissions, but we did. And we translated them, James did the final translation and the editing, which really turned what had been done before into poetry. So we have this collection, and we thought that it was really important for people to see and to read what was produced by him, even while he was imprisoned. The last thing I want to mention is where he is imprisoned, because until we know otherwise, we assume that all of the disappeared continue to be imprisoned. He is imprisoned in Berdyev, which is a brutal secret prison, it's called. And there's a special wing of the Berdyev prison which was built for political prisoners and where political prisoners are held, incommunicado from the other prisons. And we also, the campaign did research into Berdyev, and we had a few years ago a really interesting partnership with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where they actually took satellite images. We found out when Berdyev was being constructed, and we have satellite images of the process of that construction. So we know approximately the size of the cells, we know where it's located, and it's a gruesome place. We have a report if anybody is interested in reading about the conditions in Berdyev, but it is really a brutal, inhumane place, and it's a place where Berdyev and the others who were disappeared, we believe are being held. So that's sort of the environment in which the poetry was created. I think I'll stop with that for the moment.
Thank you. Maybe James, if we can turn to you to speak a little bit about the process and the context of this particular body of work, where it fits into, I would say, the canon of this type of literature, and how you went about translating.
Okay. Yeah, I think the first thing I wanted to do is just read a couple of poems. I only have one poem, but in Russian and in English translation, because the book exists as an example of a particular. It's an important political document, but it's also a very important, very interesting poetic one. So I'll just read one poem. Землетрясение судьбы. Вот и уходит этот коловорот. Но где-то курил, разорыл, что только смог. И теперь за останки сожженных ворот он уходит, шатун, в нашей жизни злой рок. Ты его не кори, не ругай, не прощай. Он был должен таким быть, как наша любовь. Пусть горит в наших душах свечой печаль, и останется в нас навсегда эта боль. Будем помнить и чтить тех, кто не пережил, кто оставил нам жить, несмотря ни на что, и тянуть из последних не рвущихся жил нашу жизнь условней и твердить хорошо. Мы пройдем этот путь, мы встроимся вновь, мы поднимем наш дом и в нем рамки зажжем. На обломках судьбы станет кремнем любовь, и прольется судьба очищения дождем. И тогда мы воздвигнем в душе новый храм, окропим его памятью боли и ран, и простит, и помнет наши годы Рахман, и, быть может, сочтутся страдания нам. The earthquake fate. So the year is moving on. The wheel of life, having torn and ruined what it could, moves on now, past the remnants of the burnt gates. This loose beast, our evil destiny. Don't rail against it, don't curse it, don't forgive it. It was our destiny. Things had to be this way. Let the sad candle burn in our souls. Let this ache remain with us forever. We will remember and honour those who didn't survive, who left us something to live for no matter what. And with our last unbroken sinews, we will haul our life and its dwellers onwards, saying, goodness exists. We will walk this path. We will build ourselves anew. We will raise our house and light its lamps again. Our love will be a firm foundation on the debris of fate, and our future will come down like a cleansing rain. And then we will build a new temple in our soul, and disperse it with our memory of pain and wounds. Rahman will forgive us and understand these years, and it may be that our pain will come to a reckoning. Rahman mentioned in the poems Berdyev's son, who I can't remember how old he was when Berdev was.
He was very young.
2, I think. So that's just to give you a sort of general idea of the approach of the poetry, the scope of some of the things it's doing. It's quite sad to have to acknowledge this, but there is a very strong, very firm tradition in Russian literature of poetry that deals with being in prison, dealing with hostile governments, being unfairly separated from family, friends, from any kind of organized society within which you can exist freely. And I think one of the things that that immediately struck me about these poems when I was first sent them to think about was the way in which they enter entirely naturally and entirely comfortably into this tradition. I mean, it's not a comfortable tradition in itself, but they are poems that are in dialogue with a lot of the writing about memory, about grief, about imprisonment that has come out of Russia over the years. It's quite easy to think about Russian literature. I mean, for the purposes of this book, I think we identify this as Russian literature. It's written by a Turkmen citizen who comes from Turkmenistan, but he chose to write in Russian. He chose to present this poetry in Russian. It's a tradition that begins with, and begins as far back as you want to go. Russian poetry has always, to some extent, been in dialogue with structures of power standing against it, or which it has a very uneasy relationship with. But if you go back to such writers as Alexander Pushkin, the primary fundamental figure in Russian literature, you see that he has already in this very early stage, he's discovered the major theme of Russian literature, the balance or the attempt at finding a balance between the individual and the state, or between the person who refuses to be subservient to a particular set of rules. And this is something that, although Pushkin was never imprisoned, he was sent into exile. Lermontov, who came after him, who wrote a powerful panegyric poem when Pushkin died, called On the Death of a Poet, was also sent into exile for this particular behaviour. Generations of writers have taken this as their theme, and I think that is one of the most striking and most moving things about these poems, is that they acknowledge, and not with resignation. I mean, you heard in the poem that I read that he's not saying this is, he says this is our fate, but he also says this is a fate that we can overcome. You know, we will rebuild things, we will light the lamps again. But acknowledging that it is the natural condition of mankind to be faced with and to stand against external forces that are always trying to push him down. And as we move into the 20th century, the figure, I mean, this figure becomes more and more important. Russian literature that came out of the Soviet period, especially in the 1930s, was being very firmly allied to this particular way of thinking. There was, I mean, it becomes very dangerous because we end at the beginning of in the 20th century in a way that we haven't had perhaps previously in Russian letters. The structures of power start to understand the danger of writing. This is partly a result of mass literacy, partly a result of, there are more people who can read and therefore the written word gains a certain degree of power. But we have, for example, in the 1930s, the very famous quote from Mandelstam, which I didn't have famous, but I had to write it down, sorry. This is a recorded statement his wife, and he'd been arrested and he got out before he was finally arrested for the last time. He was talking to his wife. Что ты себя жалуешься? Поэзия уважает Бога у нас, за нее убивает. So why are you complaining? This is the only country where people respect poetry, the only country where they're willing to kill for it. And I think that once the particular autocratic structures of power realized that poetry was a tool, things became much more complicated and much more difficult for writers. And poetry, or it could be a tool, sorry. And poetry became a form by which opposition to autocracy could be stated, and by which this opposition could be actualized. And that brings us to Batyr Berdyev and these poems, which are absolutely universal in the way they in their scope, in the way they set themselves out. They're written, you see from they're dated, and Kate said, they're written over a very short period of time. I mean, the first one dates, Batyr was arrested on the 7th of December, and the first one is dated the 16th of December. So he started writing very soon after his arrest. And the impression you get, I mean, it makes a great deal of sense that this collection has been published with the title Kismet Hashem, the parting song. The impression that you get is somebody who is forced into a particular situation and not settling scores, but writing his testament, setting down how he wants to be remembered and how he wants to fit into the, how he wants to be seen as white, how he wants to fit into this particular history within which he finds himself. And I just want to say two more things before I stop. First is to quote Arkady Dubnov's introduction to the book, where he says, можно ведь любить, что называется, не выходя из дома, не вырываясь в постели, а можно, совершая поступки, которые должны сделать мне лучше, дать ему шанс на будущее, which is, it's possible to love, as it's called, without leaving home, without getting out of bed, it's also possible while doing things that will make the world better and give us a chance at a future. And that's a philosophy that is absolutely embodied in this poetry, and it fits into a very long Russian tradition of looking towards the future and working while we're alive to get into, to make sure there's some hope of the future. And the other thing that I picked up when I was thinking about which poem I wanted to read, and this one sort of sprang out at me, is this idea of building a new temple in our soul. And there's a very famous late Soviet film called Repentance, directed by George Levit and Tengiz Alwasi. It ends with a scene that's become famous even outside of the film, which is that an old woman knocks on the door of the protagonist and asks where the road that the house is built on, where it leads. And she says, does it lead to a church? And the protagonist says, no, it doesn't. And the woman says, so what's the point of a road if it doesn't lead to a church? And I think that Berdyev, one of the things he does, one of the things that these poems do, is to suggest that these questions still need to be asked, and even more so in the conditions under which these poems were written. I think that's what I would say for that. About that.
Thank you for that very thorough analysis in terms of really the universal aspect of this poetry. I think that's an important consideration here as we think about how arts and advocacy will lead to more visibility, particularly around Berdyev's case and those of the many others who remain disappeared. I was wondering if, in that vein, you could talk a little bit about the OSCE and the context of some of the international advocacy around this. As you had alluded to earlier, the Moscow mechanism, a human rights mechanism within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's framework, was invoked with the now no longer new president in order to try and bring more attention to these cases in Turkmenistan. And that was many years ago now, and there, of course, is talk of trying to explore these mechanisms now. I was wondering if you could maybe debrief us on the conversations, Kate, that happened at the OSCE's Human Dimension Implementation meeting, where you first presented Berdyev's poetry. And to provide a little context for this, it's particularly relevant because he was a part of the diplomatic mission representing Turkmenistan at the OSCE in Vienna, Austria, before he was disappeared. So if you could speak to that briefly.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, the Moscow mechanism was invoked in 15 years ago, March 2003, and a very, probably the most comprehensive report ever written, really, by Professor Emmanuel Decaux, who was a special rapporteur who wrote about the situation and initially collected the information. And that's really become one of the key pieces of source material about the disappeared, because he did this extremely thorough job of sort of saying this is what the problem is. And the proof campaign is working now to reinvoke the Moscow mechanism and potentially other mechanisms of the OSCE with regard to Turkmenistan, because it's been 15 years, and because the government has failed really to take the recommendations that Professor Decaux made seriously. But I do want to say one thing, because sometimes people say, well, was the Moscow mechanism a failure? I mean, what did the government do? Really, maybe nothing really happened. But we know that hundreds and hundreds of people were swept up in that purge, in those days following the November coup attempt or alleged coup attempt. And many of them were released. And we believe that this is in part because the Moscow mechanism was invoked and the government realized that it needed to do something to demonstrate that they were taking seriously this. So in terms of sort of what we've been doing in the course of the past 6-7 months at the Human Dimension Implementation meeting in September in Warsaw, we did present Parting Song. It was where we sort of unveiled the book the first time, and we had a panel discussion there where James participated and Arkady Dubnov, who wrote the introduction to the book, or the foreword to the book, was there. Other members of the campaign, Yuri Zhevladze from the Center for Democracy and Rights in Russia, many of our other partners, Human Rights Watch, Helsinki Committee, Freedom Files, all these members of the campaign worked really hard to put this event together. And what was striking to me at this event was that, first of all, we had a very large attendance. And I think the fact that we had this sort of more emotional, if you will, approach or less policy wonky, excuse my phrase, approach to human rights really drew people in. And we had a lot of people who represented other Central Asian countries, in addition to Turkmenistan. There were folks from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, who all said, we can identify with this because this, as James so rightly said, these authoritarian structures are pressing on us as well. And we have people who are in prison, we have people who are disappeared. So it was this sort of really interesting mix of Western diplomats who are looking for solutions and ways to engage with their counterparts from Turkmenistan, but not only from Turkmenistan, from the other Central Asian countries. And then folks from the region who have experienced, maybe not to the extreme degree that Batyr Berdyev has experienced, but certainly have experienced or experience in their families with very similar types of repression. So, we believe that this is a really an effective and a powerful way to sort of push forward a diplomatic and an activist and a human rights agenda that sometimes we find ourselves struggling. What sort of new ways of doing this can we find? How many times can you sit and say the same things over again to sort of try and find some new approaches? And, at the end of the day, we all respond. People respond to art. People respond to art.
I think, of course, when you look at some of these international mechanisms, it all seems so abstract in the absence of really a personal story such as this and the tremendous poetry that it presents. I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little more, James, about some of the personal story that you think is told through some of this poetry in terms of the relationship with his family or any of those aspects that this poetry illuminates.
Yeah, I think that several of the poems make reference to anniversaries, make reference to particular moments when he was with his family. They talk about not as a straightforward contrast, because one of the very effective things about these poems is this sense, not perhaps of resignation, but the sense of being involved in a process that is controlled by powers that you can identify and complain against, but you can't control. But the story that comes out of the poems essentially falls into two halves, perhaps. One that you know, the way to describe this perhaps sounds a bit over analytical, but it doesn't. I mean, as you read the poems, you'll see it's not that way at all. But one half that is perhaps taking place within time, the half before he was disappeared, before he was arrested. So there are poems of memory, poems of speaking about trips that he took with his wife and also with his then very young child, remembering particular, times or periods of time of freedom. And then the other half, which is static and involves being unable to do anything, being unable to move, to act. And these poems come from time in prison. So there are lots of poems which talk about the routine in the prison, talk about the way in which each day is the same as the next. And it's only the memory of this time outside of the prison that in some cases it appears that it's only that keeps him going and gives him a certain amount of hope to cling on to. I think that's the story that comes out of this collection.
So at this stage, wanted to see if there were any questions from the field here, from the audience, if anybody wanted to ask anything, and then we'll open up the conversation first, and then maybe conclude our conversation with another selection. So I'm teeing you up, James, to consider another selection. All right, questions here in the front first.
I'm ready for your Liberty, James. First to you. So when you were going through his poems, what is the thematic highlight that you came across with him? What is his focus? Seems to be, and also you mentioned that this collection covers a certain time frame. I believe he started writing from December 17th and continued. So does his focus changes over the time?
I think.
And how does it change? In which way? Also, does his emotion change? Does his way of expressing things change?
I think one of the very interesting things about this as a collection of poems is that it is very focused by virtue of having been written in a very short time period. I mean, there are not many. If I'm speaking as a poet, if I can say that, there's not. I mean, there's a lot of writing you find very, very hard, and you work on it again and again and again in order to polish it and get it perfect. But there's a sense with these poems that they are coming out of a zone that is perhaps best described as being a place of inspiration. That there's not a great deal of obvious rethinking and reworking and reorganization of the materials. He's written it down as it has come to him, as it were. So I think that the main focus of these poems is quite clearly the relationship with his family and the way in which that was suddenly broken and stopped by his arrest. And it's an interesting question, because I don't think, I sort of qualify to it, I'd say I don't think it necessarily develops over the course of the poems. I think in 6 weeks, it's not that you see an arc moving from defiance to resignation or whatever. I mean, I don't think you see that sort of emotional journey, but it's a series. The poems are a series of explorations of this feeling of loss or separation, and he looks at the main fact, which is his arrest and the loss of his family, in a very wide variety of ways, I think.
Other questions?
Can I have one more question? We have been working together in this for a long time now, and during your advocacy work, what's the biggest hurdle, or let me put it this way, what's the biggest opposition you face when you ask for more accountability of cases like this involving Turkmenistan? What I'm trying to know is, this in terms of achieving a concrete result of these really big human cases, what is that, holding it?
You mean what's the
Yeah.
concrete result?
Yeah.
Good question. I mean, you're right, we've been working on this campaign for a while now, and our organization has been working in Turkmenistan for a long time now. I would say that the biggest obstacle in terms of overall, in terms of working with Turkmenistan, is just the absolute absence of information, official information, and the unwillingness to respond. And it's like a big black hole throwing, questions into this empty space, and perhaps there will be some sort of response. There is no official response. And there has been no real official response to the campaign. What is disturbing is that over the course of the last several months, there seems to be an effort to discredit the campaign. And not just the campaign, to discredit those outside of Turkmenistan who are working on this and similar issues by providing disinformation, by raising questions that would seemingly disqualify or discredit the work and the information that our campaigns put out. But what I will say is that our main researcher, Vitaly Ponomaryov, who's from Memorial, Human Rights Center Memorial, which is, I don't think there's a more highly respected human rights organization working on these issues. And we have a very high level we have a very high standard, very high level before we will even publish information. So I would say that our list is a minimal list. It's a list that we've been able to double, triple, quadruple check and make sure that the facts and information that we have are correct and are right. We don't just hear something somewhere and put it into our information. We have a very strong process for verification. So I would say that's the difficulty. The big difficulty is just the absence of information, the absence of participation, real participation in international mechanisms. The OSCE is a good example. For years, the Turkmen government wasn't participating in the HDIM. A couple of years, they brought representatives who actually spoke, engaged, and participated. This last year, again, they did not show up. What is their participation in the OSCE or in any of these other international institutions about if they're not actually willing to engage in the type of behavior and according to the standards that the institutions represent? In terms of successes, one of them is just that. The Turkmens have acknowledged that there are disappeared people. That was not a word that was used before at the HDIM. There's been more than one reference now to the disappeared. So that's the little tiny opening of that door, right? The other thing is that this is now a discussion that is taking place on the international level. This is a topic that people know about and are engaged in. We are getting additional information from people. So, we have to remember that this is Turkmenistan, that we have to have a very low bar, if you will, of what success is compared to, you know, we were working in Sweden or someplace like that, right? These are two very different types of governments. But this discussion is happening, and they're being held to account. And I think we can call that a success.
Questions with that? Go all the way back.
Thank you. Sylvester Pirous, Separation Program, George Washington University. I just would like to follow up, Kate, with what you said in your presentation. I mean, since this book was released, indeed, I think it was circulated a lot, and indeed, it contributed a lot to make people more aware about what's happening in this country in terms of human rights, but beyond human rights. And as you said too, I think that this kind of cultural activities, cultural initiatives, really, it's a way to reach a wider audience or a different audience. So my question to you, or to Alex, or I mean to the three of you, would be: could we imagine other cultural initiatives like that for Turkmenistan, but maybe beyond Turkmenistan? Because again, I mean, I think we need to go beyond reports on human rights, on economic, I mean, all the facts that money stolen, and so on, which is very, very important, of course. But again, as you said, Ken, I think it's so important to be able to reach a different audience. So, is there any initiative in the pipes already, or how can we imagine something like that?
Thank you for that, Sebastian. Yes, I mean, this is something that we are really thinking hard about and exploring, and there will be other events over the course of the next, at least through the end of this year, with Parting Song and perhaps with other pieces of art or literature coming in that really make an effort to focus on the more cultural pieces. And I think this is an area that we're starting to explore much more carefully. You know, I think one of the things that you know, this sort of more personal approach really highlights, and what I think is really of critical importance, specifically in the case of Batyr Berdyev, is that, you know, as was said, he was a diplomat. He represented Turkmenistan in Europe in a variety of capacities. He had Western friends. He knew people in the OSCE and the embassy communities, and he was a man who was very cultured. He was, by all accounts, very funny, very pleasant, very engaged and interactive. And I think what happens on some level is when people see these and read these poems and hear about this person, they realize, you know, this could happen to any of us, right? This is, sadly, this is a common shared human experience. And this tendency this human tendency that we have to sort of think, this is very extreme, this happens over there, this happens in this kind of a circumstance with these type of people, right? That's blown away when you read this song and you know who this person was, and that sort of us and them gets merged. And this is part of our effort too, in terms of collecting not only the statistical and data-driven information about, you know, when were they arrested, and who were they, and what were the criminal charges against them, but who was this person? What were his hobbies? What did he do with his family? This is a whole human being who has disappeared. And each one of those stories is a personal tragedy. And so you're right, I think that the cultural piece of it is what allows us to get to that story, and it's certainly something that we're exploring. And what's interesting, just very quickly, in another campaign that Good Accountability is involved with, we've come to the end stage of a specific campaign that we're working on. And the participants in the campaign from that region, in that story, are now saying, we want to write this story, we want to tell this story, we want to get our personal involvement in what's happened here out. So I think it's a natural sort of human impulse to speak, as Jane said, to the road leads to the temple, and that temple in many, many regards is a temple of art.
Yeah, and I think that as well, I was talking about this with someone else yesterday, that Turkmenistan in particular, certainly in the English press, when it's mentioned almost as a fairy tale. You know, this is a country with gold statues where that crazy guy renamed the days of the week and so on. I mean,
Right.
without sort of thinking about the human dimension. So it's not just the problem of, you know, the geopolitics, the statistics and so on, but also in some senses, the self-presentation of the regime, because from the outside, it looks kind of kooky, whereas actually we should be saying always and as loud as possible that this isn't unreal, it's very horrible.
To respond briefly, to think tactically about how do we mobilize and empower those who haven't had a voice. There are some creative things that have happened in recent years around music, around the solidarity of various artists and various art forms. I know there was a large concert series, a Global Citizen, that happens each year. They had an event here in Washington and elsewhere. There are a number of initiatives where maybe this story can also be told in the context of the universal challenge of political prisoners throughout the world, and finding artists and other advocates that can support that particular cause. So that's something that could be an exploration for the future for the campaign. So we had questions in the back here. We had first over here, and then we'll go.
My name is Eric Kuhn. First, thank you for your literary advocacy and policy work in a part of the world that is difficult to get attention to. Hey, I'm more interested in, I guess, what we call a risk management approach from your side. Given all the esteemed partners that you've worked with, it's a wonderful book of poems. Was there a moment where you had to assess whether or not publishing this would aid or harm the potential outcome? I agree that there are lots of creative opportunities to raise visibility for situations like this, but where do you decide where you're going to stop? You asked Jimmy Buffett to cut ourselves wasting away in Master and Margarita films, or raise attention to something like this, or how do you weigh what works and what could be more harmful?
That's an excellent question. We weigh everything that we do, first of all. And you're absolutely right. When we first obtained the poems, we held on to them for a very long time before we did anything with them other than read them and weep, sort of. I mean, it was heartbreaking. Because we didn't know. We had received them through a very sort of circuitous route. But the other thing is that over time, things change over time. So if we have permission to do something 2015 as an example, and we don't get to doing that, or for whatever reason we're unable to do it for a period of time, we cannot assume that the yes we received in 2015 is a yes in 2018, for example. So it's really, best thing I can say is that it's an ongoing dialogue, and it's an ongoing assessment also of risk, because in the end, in this campaign particularly, but really in almost all of the work that we do, we have to assess and evaluate risks to our partners. We have to assess and evaluate risks to those who might somehow be impacted by what we're doing, who we may not be directly engaging with, but are somehow impacted by our work. And we have to assess the impact and risk to ourselves. And those types of risk and the scale of risk in all three of those instances is quite different. So we have systems in place, we have, sort of technologies that we use, but it's really about that human engagement with the other people. And for us in this instance, the most important thing was to have permission directly from the family.
Well, just a quick follow-up. You mentioned there being practically no information coming from government or anyone else. Is it possible for you to give access if it's banned inside Turkmenistan and there are other people passing it around underground, and are they being arrested for possessing copies of it?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, the book is available in hard copy and online. We also know that a lot of sites are blocked or banned in Turkmenistan, but in addition to a long tradition of poetry and resistance writing, there is a very long and beautiful tradition of samizdat in the former Soviet space. And you mentioned Master Margarita. I heard a beautiful story once from someone who lived in a very remote region of Turkmenistan who obtained a samizdat copy of Master Margarita and how it changed this person's life. So we don't know the answer to that question, but we can assume that some information gets through. And we can hope that some information gets through. And that's part of it.
Hi, I'm Kathy Cosman. Thank you so much for this great session. Turkmenistan is close to my heart. I want, if you'll forgive me, I wanted to make a few scattered observations about things relevant to our session. I think the culture aspect is a formal part of the OSCE. And as someone, culture vulture, I guess, for want of a better term, speaking for myself, I've always been surprised that culture and this kind of work that you're now so well doing has not long been a more important part of the OSCE process. So I'm really glad that that's finally happening, and I hope it will happen more. I think the Moscow mechanism was introduced in 1991, and if I remember correctly, I think Turkmenistan is the only country against, apropos of whom or which, it has been used. I'm curious, Alex, maybe you know.
Belarus as well.
Belarus, okay. On to a totally different point, the Russian world. I think we should steal the Kremlin's use of that term, Ruski Mir, and apply it to exactly the kind of situation you're talking, context in which you're using it now. I mean, here you have a leading Turkmen diplomat who is writing heart-wrenching poetry, not in Turkmen or Turkish, but in Russian. And I do think that the Ruski Mir in the post-Soviet world should not be only viewed the way the Kremlin views it as, a possible, shall we say, excuse for further imperialism, but rather in a cultural context again, in a positive way. And then turning to another, one of my examples, I think I've mentioned this to you, Kate, and that is an example of another Turkmen writer, a woman, Anna Sultan Kikilova, who died in psychiatric hospital. Don't know exactly when, but the reason she was imprisoned was because in Soviet times she wrote, late 80s, she died in psychiatric prison. She wrote a letter to the Moscow Central Committee protesting the status of women in Turkmenistan. And I believe there has been a film made about her. I don't know, maybe someone here knows more details about it, but I believe that is true, that fairly recently there's a film been made. And finally, I think it'd be very interesting to explore the different kinds of tactics that various OSCE states use to respond to human rights criticism. And I think various countries obviously have different kinds of tactics. And I hate to say it, but I think Turkmen silence is one of the most effective ones. So these are the end of my scattered observations, and of course any reactions would be very much appreciated.
And maybe before a quick response, do we have one more question in the back? And we'll collect questions. No, that was it. All right. So if you wanted to respond to any of those reactions.
Sure. I mean, I think my first reaction is that I think, you know, we need to be really creative in terms of using art as, I hate to say it this way, but as an advocacy tool for sort of the shortcut. And to really take advantage of the institutional structures that exist that we could use, even if, and maybe even especially if that's in ways that would sort of be unexpected. The OSCE may have had certain ideas around culture that they don't necessarily have to be the ideas that we come with, but that could be used in that way. And I think that's absolutely right. I think that this sort of long history of imprisoning people who speak out, whether it's in psychiatric hospitals, whether it's in prisons, is really also something that we could do very successfully in terms, especially this idea of Ruski Mir, and what are the, you know, sort of what is the overarching similarity, if you will, rather than what's different now that this is not the Soviet Union anymore, this is not Russia is its own country. Just sort of in response to that, I mentioned this to my colleagues a couple of days ago, I've been reading Into the Whirlwind again with Katie Ginsburg. And what's so striking to me is how similar the absence of logic, this sort of bureaucratic spiderweb that people get stuck in once they come to the attention of the authorities for whatever reason. And how rationality does not get you out. Explaining does not get you out. This idea that, well, we'll just write to Moscow, or we'll just tell the president, or we'll write, I mean, we see this even in Kazakhstan when we first started working with Beryozovka when things were bad. We'll just write to President Nazarbayev. Once he knows, everything will be fixed. This idea that you just somehow leapfrog over the process and get further and further entrenched and enmeshed in this system that from the beginning had absolutely no intention of letting you go. And this is what we see with Batyr, and this is what we see with Disappeared. And if this kind of logic isn't going to work for you, then we're just going to switch it and do a flip and come over here, and suddenly your arguments for that argument, we're not talking about that anymore, we're over here. I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd. And I think part of where art can address that piece of it is that our traditional advocacy instinct or methodology is to have arguments, right? To point out where something is flawed, to show where there's been a legal violation, to show where something is wrong. And that if this piece is fixed, then it all comes together. And when you're working with tyranny, when you're working with terror, that doesn't work. What works is that punch to the heart, not for the tyrant, but for those who, for whatever reason, have been saying, well, that's different from our trade agreement, or that doesn't really impact our diplomatic relations, or our pipeline doesn't really have anything to do with your prison system. Well, actually, yes, it does. And here's how we're going to show you. And that, to me, is really where the power of art comes in, because it again comes back to that human tragedy. It comes back to who is the human being here whose rights have been totally trampled. And it's much harder to turn away from that than it is to turn away from Article 3 of the Criminal Code that was violated in this procedural problem.
But I think also, speaking in terms of what can be done art is actually one of the very few aspects of a country's production, as it were, that isn't isn't essentially under the control of the people at the top.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you think about, I'm a publisher in England as well. So if you think about what gets published and how it gets published, what people choose to publish, they're not saying, what are we being told to publish by Turkmen institutions or whatever. If they do decide to publish a contemporary Turkmen book, it will be because of its values within a different set of a different form of cultural understanding. So I think it's also a way into advocacy, because it's not something that is under direct state control. I mean, they can stop things being exported from the country, they can stop manuscripts getting out, or whatever. But as you say, there are circuitous ways, and these poems got out, and these poems had their effect. So I think it is something to concentrate on, perhaps for those reasons.
And with that, if we could actually hear another selection from you, James, in terms of sharing the human aspect of this poetry, and then we'll have a few announcements and conclude our discussion this morning.
Okay, I will read it again in both languages, but I haven't had a chance to practice the Russian, so if, my stress is all over the place, and so just laugh quietly to yourselves. But this one doesn't have a title. Кто сказал, что надежда умирает последней? Да все отшумел, отжалось, отжилось. Если души бессмертны, то бессмертный посредник между нами и небом и сплылось, не сплылось. То, что с нами случилось, даже самая малость, будет где-то в реестре книг судьбы внесено, и, наверное, где-то, что не домечталось, будет помниться кем-то чудо жизни едино. И когда мы покинем дом, и все так знакомо, и цветочная ваза, как трёпкий палас, нашей тихой надежды, тень останется дома, отражаясь в глазах тех, кто помнит о нас. И проложится снова жизнь, как наша когда-то, и, конечно, и мне будут песни звучать, но сердце человечье, как надежды солдат, будут снова и снова и страдать, и мечтать. И когда так лучисто смотрит сын в ожидании, то сегодня надежда вдруг случится его. В этом взгляде лукавом, в глубине самой дальней, все надежды тается всех ушедших веков. Who said that hope dies last, when all the bustle and waiting and living is over? If souls are immortal, then the mediator between us and heaven is immortal, and all that has happened may not have been true. What has happened to us, even the most trifling thing, will be entered somewhere into fate's registry book, and probably somewhere our unfulfilled dreams will be remembered by someone, woven into someone's life. And when we leave our house, where all is so familiar, flower vase and worn-out carpet, the shadow of our quiet hope will stay at home, reflected in the eyes of those who remember us. And life will continue, as our life was once lived. And of course, other songs will be sung. But human hearts, like soldiers of hope, will again and again both suffer and dream. And when our son looks so radiantly in anticipation that today his hope will suddenly come true, in the deepest depths of that sly glance are harboured the hopes of all bygone ages.
Thank you, James. As personal as this poetry is, it's clearly a call to action. I think it's important that we consider, of course, this conversation here and think about how through our work we can continue to raise visibility for the disappeared in Turkmenistan and political prisoners elsewhere. I want to thank you all for your time this morning. I also wanted to announce that there will be an additional discussion on this book later tonight, today at 6:30 p.m. at Busboys and Poets on 5th and K Northwest. There will be additional readings from this particular book, and we hope that you'll join the conversation and fellowship there. First of all, I would like to actually conclude with the last line of the title poem of this particular book, Parting Song, and leave you with these thoughts. And remember this journey, remember these words. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, James, and look forward to our conversation this afternoon.
Thank you. And can I just add one thing? Alex is being very modest. He is our performer tonight of the poetry, so, or one of our performers. So please come join and see how he does justice to this beautiful, beautiful work. So
Thank you.